unemployment gets over, let's say, 15%, and I'm thinking here in terms of what's called the U3 measure of unemployment, once it gets over 15%, okay, it can go to 20, 30% and stay there. It's not going to, let's say, to go from 5% unemployment to 10% is very difficult, but to go from, let's say, 15 to 30 can happen in a flash. And just to think about the time frames here, okay, the Great Depression started roughly 1929. If you want to take from the stock market crash, it didn't end until 1940, with really 1941. So it took 12 years to really correct for that big deflationary episode. And the same thing with hyperinflation, or just another example of deflation. In 1991, the bubble economy in Japan burst, and now we're in 2010, 2011, and basically we haven't recovered yet. So inflation, that's with deflation. Inflation, we have examples in Latin America or Weimar Germany, where it took 10, 15, 20 years to really get control over inflation, and usually at a significant amount of pain. Now, what the corridor says is that there can be inflationary shocks. For example, you might default on your currency. The value of your currency to another currency might switch. This is especially true if, let's say, you owe money to foreigners. Let's say you owe money in dollars, but you're earning it, let's say, in Canadian dollars, you're earning it in pesos, or you're earning it in euros, and this currency has become debased, and therefore what happens is you start getting inflation. You could have very strong labor unions who might push prices up and up and up, and this will, let's say, create a pressure toward inflation. Then you can have what we had a few years ago, where, let's say, a single commodity like gasoline goes from around $2, $3 a gallon to $4.50 a gallon, okay, and you can get trapped in this basically inflationary trap. And I should explain here why it's a trap. If you see prices going up at 20,000% or 100% or even 20%, which is saying tomorrow the prices will be higher than they are today, everyone has an incentive to, let's say, raise their prices to stay ahead of these expected price increases. And because everyone expects tomorrow the prices will be higher for everything than they are today, everyone's going to keep increasing their prices to stay ahead of that, because you don't want to be the sucker who's going to either one who keeps your prices where they are, and everyone else, let's say, doubles or triples their prices. And so everyone has an incentive to raise prices, and everyone is throwing each other under the boat, under the bus, as you would say. And this makes, let's say, inflation gallop. Okay, it keeps accelerating, keeps accelerating, keeps accelerating. Same thing happens in the opposite direction, where you might have a deflationary shock. For example, if you have a lot of debt, if a major part of the economy reduces its spending, if there's a reduction in the amount of credit or investment, and I don't really buy this, but all of a sudden everyone wants to have a vacation tomorrow, or, for example, there's a labor-saving technology which reduces the amount of demand for jobs or labor. And what happens here is that, for example, once someone loses the job, that person can't spend money anymore, or at least can't spend money like they used to. And what that means is that less money is being spent at someone else's establishment, right? If I lose my job, okay, I'm not going to buy as many books. And therefore all those used booksellers that I usually buy from are not going to get the income that they're going to have, and they're going to lay off people. And then those people won't have a job, and then they won't have income, and they won't be able to spend money on other things, okay? And that's going to put those people out of work. And what's going to happen is that this will accelerate, because what happens is that less people have less money to spend, okay, they're not going to spend, and that will contribute to more and more people becoming unemployed, which will lead to less spending, which will lead to more unemployment, which will lead to less spending, which will lead to more unemployment, and you can see that you can get caught in this trap. And another way of describing this trap is a liquidity trap, basically a situation where money becomes useless. Or people start hoarding money, because hoarding money is more valuable than anything you could spend it on. Now, most of these corridor model is that most of these fluctuations occur in a narrow band or corridor most of the time. And the reason why you have this corridor is mostly because you have things like the Federal Reserve, which has control over something called the interest rate, which is the interest earned, or the money you earn by lending out money. And this kind of acts as a speed bump or a guardrail. It basically keeps the economy in a certain range, because if, let's say, inflation starts picking up, they can raise the interest rates. That will reduce spending, and that will, let's say, bring the economy back to somewhere in equilibrium. In the same way, if the unemployment is too high, they can lower their interest rate, and that will prop up the economy. And this effectively puts guardrails on the system that keeps the economy from getting out of control. Now, the problem in our current situation is that the Federal Reserve's interest rate is at 0, which means there's no guardrail on one side. And this is what worries people, is that what can happen is that, right, if there's no guardrail, and if, let's say, you are a bad driver, there's a very little shock can, let's say, send you off to one side into that deflationary trap. And that's not a good thing. Now, explaining that it depends on where you are, and will tell you how the economy functions. Within these normal ranges, the economy basically functions like the rocking horse model that we met before. But at high and low levels of inflation or unemployment, you can have runaway feedback effects that can, let's say, get you trapped. Now, a big part of this, as I told that story about deflation and inflation, is that expectations are really important, because a lot of this is self-fulfilling prophecies. If I think prices are going to go up, and everyone else thinks prices are going to go up, guess what? Prices are going to go up. It's not objective. Same thing with if I think prices are going to go down. If I think prices are going to go down, I'm going to want to hold money, because money is going to be more valuable tomorrow than it is today, because I can buy more stuff tomorrow, because everything will be cheaper. So think of this like a holiday sale, and you see this wonderful item, but you know, let's say, for example, tomorrow it's Christmas, and the day after Christmas, all the Christmas stuff, the price is 75% off, and let's say I want to buy Christmas lights for next year. I'm not going to buy it today. I'm going to wait till the prices get slashed, okay, and then I'll buy it tomorrow. Well, if the whole economy is this, that means they want to keep money, because they know tomorrow that money is going to be more valuable because I can buy more stuff with the same amount of money. But if everyone does that, okay, nothing is going to be spent, and if nothing is spent, you know, there's not, let's say, a lot of demand in the economy. But the thing about expectations is that if you believe the economy is going to behave normally, it will behave normally. If you believe that inflation is going to happen, inflation is going to happen. If you believe that deflation is going to happen, you're going to get deflation. So this is very different than the other models that basically say the economy is responding to objective things. This is saying that the economy is responding to their self-fulfilling prophecies. The expectations of the public can actually determine what direction the economy is going to go in. And another part of the corridor model is that if you fall, and this is true of the disco model as well, if you fall into one of those stable, non-optimal equilibriums, there's no self-correcting mechanism. It could just get worse. And so these shocks can trap you in either high or low, let's say high inflation, or high deflation, or high unemployment, and it's not just going to work itself out. Time is not going to fix everything, and these shocks are not going to be self-correcting. So let me give you an example, and this is why you should be worried, particularly about that we might be into, let's say, off this corridor into a bad way. So this shows you what happened in Japan after the bubble economy popped in 1991. So you can see this blue line shows you that the inflation rate, the CPI, excluding food and energy, is going down and down and down. Okay, so this basically goes from Japan 1989 to 1999. As you can see, you've had a deflationary environment. Inflation is less each year. Now, this is basically saying unemployment has gone up. And you can see the most recent episode in the United States, where you can see our own CPI, excluding food and energy, is basically tracking Japan, which is suggesting that we're kind of on that edge there. You can see we kind of dip below 2% inflation, which means we're on the bad side of the corridor, and things might get worse. And Japan's now about 20 years into their burst bubble, and they still really haven't recovered. And we might be headed to the same place. Now you could have, let's say, similar things happening with inflation, which is you can see here we have the countries of Yugoslavia, Zimbabwe, Argentina, and Brazil. And you can see if you go in 1983, roughly, the prices of something might be 1, 100, 1,000. But you can see what happened to the prices over a relatively short period of time. So from roughly 1983 to about 1991, in Brazil, things went from around an index number of 700 to about 100 trillion. So that's a many, many times increase in terms of prices. Same thing happened in Argentina, although maybe not as dramatic. Same thing happened in the former Yugoslavia, mostly as a function of the war. When there's war, the government prints money. The government prints money to finance the war. Prices in the economy skyrocket because war is basically like that, inflationary, deflationary shock. Same thing in Zimbabwe. A lot of printing money ever since Mugabe came to power, and that's kind of, let's say, increased prices in that country. Now, to get to our last model, I need to explain another concept, and that's called elasticity. And elasticity is basically the sensitivity of quantity to price. How much will quantity change compared to a change in price? Now, this is basically the slope of the supply and demand curve. Okay, so if the slope is vertical, that means no matter what happens to the price, the quantity is going to stay the same. If the supply and demand curve is horizontal, that means that no matter what the quantity is, the price will be the same. The price will be the same for 1 unit as it is for 1,000 units. And you can have perfectly inelastic, perfectly elastic, or unit elastic, which means that basically the slope of the curve is basically some y equals 3x, and 3 is the unit elasticity. So here we see it kind of on the same graph, and this is the way that I remember it. Perfectly elastic is a horizontal line, and I draw an E, with, let's say, the bottom part of the E being the x-axis, the spine of the E being the y-axis, and the elastic demand or supply curve line kind of being a line in the E. Now, inelastic is the vertical line, so think of this as the vertical line sitting on the x-axis, standing for inelastic. Now, a big difference between, let's say, we talked about last time about those who believe a vertical curve is basically saying no free lunch. Everything has to trade off with something else. A horizontal line is saying kind of the second rule, that the whole is greater or less than the sum of its parts. Because Keynesians basically think that the supply curve is basically horizontal. Most people in between think it's kind of that curve, just like our supply and demand curves we saw when we're talking about increasing and decreasing returns. And classical thinkers basically think the supply curve, i.e. resources are scarce, which is basically saying that there is a vertical line. There's only so much oil, coal, iron in the world, okay, and that's a vertical line. Supply curve is basically long run. It's a vertical line. Now, let me just go through some examples of different examples of what are inelastic and elastic curves. Now, perfectly inelastic is a perfectly vertical line. What does a perfectly vertical demand line mean? Well, this could be an addictive behavior, right? I want a certain quantity of a drug, and the price doesn't matter, right? If I'm a junkie, I need a certain hit of my